The Black Alliance for Peace seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement. We're, an alliance and network. We're also an organization of radical Black internationalists. Just to say that we are in fundamental solidarity with all people who are oppressed by structures of global supremacy that we refer to in this very concise way of the pan-European white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy. And so that's very important that when we're talking about militarization, what is militarization protecting? Right? Why is it being propped up? It is to protect this system. It is part of this system. It's to perpetuate that system. These are some of our principles of unity as BAP, just so you all know where we're coming from. I'll say a couple of things. One is the Black radical peace tradition, that BAP is not a pacifist movement, right? We believe that peace is not the absence of conflict, right? But peace is the overcoming of the structures of oppression that I just named. So no compromise, no retreat, what is it? Obviously it's a slogan, as we mentioned earlier, but it is a campaign. And understanding that the violence in the United States is linked to the violence throughout the world, right? This chart on the right-hand side is the number of US troops deployed in Iraq, and then the amount of combat gear from the Pentagon that went to the police. So you can see really clearly that as troops declined, steadily the weapons that were being made for those troops found their markets in our cities, right? That we understand, if we understand capitalism, colonialism, right? We understand that it's not only war to go after and get resources, war is also a structure that needs to reproduce itself on the domestic level as well, right? Particularly after World War II, but we won't get into all that history. But it's very important that for the capitalist class, right, and for the warmongers in both, the duopoly of warmongers that control our political system, that war is not only profitable, it is necessary for this system to exist. Yeah. And that's why you see these things like this, that it's not a coincidence, it is directly correlated that when folks are coming home, they said, we want to keep on making these weapons, we want to keep on making this money, and the market to do that is in our cities and in our neighborhoods, primarily in Black and neighborhoods and other neighborhoods of other colonized people and the working class. And so you see that in some of the programs that we're going to talk about, like the 1033 program. And so no compromise, no retreat. As we think about the campaign, right, the campaign is not like a singular campaign just focused on 1033, right? Or just focused on Cop City, right? Or just focused on these things, because we understand that the tactics of the state can change, right? As Kamal mentioned, those plans for Cop City were sitting there waiting to be used, right? And there may come a time when that plan, where that strategy no longer serves the interests of the state. But our resistance has to know that, right? Has to understand those strategies and tactics of the state. And so that's why we take this broader kind of strategic and tactical framework so that we can adjust to the dynamics as conditions change, right? And so our goal for this campaign is to think about how do we build a common collective direction that thinks about peace, and again, not peace in terms of absence of conflict, but peace in terms of the defeat of these systems, right? So that we can build a different system. People-centered human rights, which are not, the Eurocentric human rights framework that is utilized in the UN that fundamentally devalues the lives of our people, but is a system that is directly opposed to those oppressive forces, right? And creating an alternative and understanding that the only rights that we have are the rights that we struggle for and the rights that we can exercise. And that those rights are determined through collective processes, but we can only get to those collective processes if we're able to defeat the current system that is oppressing us and take power. And then third, thinking about anti-imperialist education and organizing of our movement, right? So these are sort of the things that the campaign is thinking about. And then we also want to provide a broad framework for resistance and for coordination. Right, so that looks like providing the framework for, again, resistance, taking action, understanding how do we resist militarization of the state, and also how do we coordinate among ourselves. Because BAP is one organization, it is an alliance, but we also think that the framework of this campaign, the thinking behind it, the various demands, should be taken up by other organizations. We should not be doing everything. We cannot do everything, right? And so we need to understand what is our framework for, even if we are doing different things, how are we coordinating, right? Because the state is coordinated. That is the benefit of the military structure, is that it is very good at coordinating actions, right? And so we need to also be thinking about how we are coordinating and how we are resisting, and thinking about that, both in BAP as well as in our member organizations, our members, but also among all the different organizations in our movement. And so as part of that, kind of leads into that, is that we see an integral part of this as building Black left unity, right? As part, and building with the broader movements that are connected to us. There's sort of 4 overall campaign demands, right? We're going through a process as well of updating these demands. So these are the newest, the freshest set of demands, but they may shift a little bit as we go through our collective processes. One is to demilitarize the U.S. by eliminating the programs that facilitate the arming and colonial training of police forces and law enforcement and provide cover for the abuses and killings of African, Black, nationally oppressed, and working class peoples and our neighborhoods. And then you see below that, there's some specific programs, the 1033 program, the Deadly Exchange, and some others. The second is dismantling the militarized infrastructure of US-led imperialism and the US-EU-NATO axis of domination domestically and globally. And so stop cop cities. Cop cities, you'll see, are there, and then also thinking about the foreign military bases and the command structures and NATO. And then third, the sort of external, or the kind of the demands that we are organizing around, is asserting the sovereignty, dignity, and right to self-determination of our people, right? By ending the violations of our people's-centered human rights. And you'll see things there like ending economic warfare, shutting down ICE, ending sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. And then fourth is supporting national policy imperatives that reduce militarized power and advance people-centered human rights. And so what that means is that there are certain policies, and this is not something that we are necessarily actively organizing around in BAP, but there are certain policies like reducing the military budget by 50%, right? Or getting the US to sign on to the UN Charter for Human Rights. Now, we're not necessarily spending our time organizing for that because we know there's a reason the US has not signed on to the UN Charter for Human Rights. There's a reason the military budget is the way it is, but it's also important to recognize that where there are potential material benefits to reduce militarized power and our human rights, that we should be supporting those things. And so today we want to talk a little bit, or we want to focus on these 4 demands that you see up here. So one is abolishing the Department of Defense 1033 program and all military equipment transfers and purchases to police. That is the graph that you saw. That was sort of from a blog talking about the 1033 program. And this is a program that many of your cities probably have. Almost, many cities have them. Only a few. I think Vermont is the only state in the country that doesn't have a city with the 1033 program. And so this allows folks to use the excess weaponry from the Pentagon or other equipment from the Pentagon and to get that basically for free, right? Oftentimes, right? Or for the most part for free. But there's other weapons transfers programs as well, and equipment transfers. Second is the Deadly Exchange, right? And so this is the training of US police forces by forces of the Zionist occupation. And so many of our cities are also engaged in that as well. If you live in New York or in the area, the NYPD actually has an office in Tel Aviv. And many programs, even though they don't have necessarily physical representation in occupied Palestine, the Zionist forces are coming in and training, right? Obviously, we know the story of how George Floyd was murdered with the knee on the neck, and that is a standard practice of the forces of the Zionist occupation. Third is obviously stopping Cop City. That's a critical aspect in thinking about where we are right now and the tactics used by the state. And then fourth is also responding to the current moment, and not necessarily the current moment under Trump, but the current moment of that I would honestly, goes back probably to at least the war on Iraq, but I'm sure even before then under Clinton, around this kind of mass hysteria around migration, right, and around these perpetual quote-unquote migrant crises that happen, every 3 years, but there's no talk about imperialism as a crisis that creates forced migration. And so for us, it's about understanding how do we shut down ICE, resist ICE locally, but then how do we also think about addressing the root causes of migration? And this is really critical in that local to global aspect, because you're not going to stop people from coming here because the system is designed to disrupt people's lands, to displace them from their lands, to expropriate their resources, right? If they're not killed, to force them to flee off of those lands and where are they going to go? To the quote-unquote land of opportunity, right? And so understanding that is an essential part of our opposition to ICE, our opposition to the kidnappings that are happening to our neighbors that are getting a lot of attention because many students are being kidnapped, but meanwhile, people in our neighborhoods, people in our communities have been being kidnapped for years, right? With little attention to that. And so thinking about that as part of this broader framework of militarization. So I just want to give an example. I'm not in Georgia, but I think it's important to understand that we're talking about Cop City. To think about as well the other forces of militarization, and this is by no means exhaustive, but if we take them by the demands that we were just thinking about, this is sort of how we think about utilizing no compromise, no retreat, how we think about connecting various aspects of struggle in our local context, right? And so you look at, obviously in the middle, we all know about Cop City. Kamal talked about it. We understand that that's happening in Atlanta. It's also happening in many other places. But even longer than Cop City, there's been going on a program called the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is a deadly exchange program where APD, Atlanta Police Department, and others train with the IOF, right, to deepen their ability to repress not only movements, but our neighborhoods, our people. And it's actually hosted at Georgia State, which is not an HBCU, but has a massive African population, right, in the state, and has grown massively over the last years. And part of that is Georgia State assuming this role as a host for Gilley and assuming this, policing function, right, and counterinsurgent function in Atlanta itself, right, and involving not only students, the administration, and also other folks like the Atlanta Police Foundation as well, which Kamal mentioned. And so they're all involved in that. Many of the same actors are involved in the Gilley program as are involved in Cop City, right? And so that, again, connects to this international question, this question of how we're not in solidarity with Palestinian people just because we understand settler colonization, just because we understand the perpetual war machine of this country and the Zionist entity and the drive to genocide that has always been part of the white supremacist project, but also because we are actively being oppressed by the exact same forces, right, that are doing those trainings, that are working together. And so that is also, Cop City will host some of those trainings as well, right? And so another piece that maybe people don't know as much about, or maybe they know about it, but they don't contextualize it in the state of Georgia, is the School of the Americas, which is now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, right? Which was founded just after World War II, is located at Fort Benning, Georgia, or at Fort Benning in Georgia, and is a program that the U.S. Department of Defense operates that trains leaders in the, quote-unquote leaders in the Americas, that if anybody knows about the history of Latin America and the Caribbean and the coups and the murders of not only activists, but the murders of thousands, tens of thousands of people throughout, especially in South America and Central America, but throughout the entire region, many of those people were trained at the School of the Americas in the exact tactics that they use, not only to overthrow the governments, but to torture, to murder, and to destabilize entire communities. And so the School of the Americas had such a bad rap that they had to rename it to this very technical sounding name, which you also want to see in Cop City as well. They closed it for 1 month, and then they reopened it under a new name. And so it's important that we understand that these things are also happening in the same place, right? Fort Benning is in a more rural location, right, in Western Georgia, but it's not far, right? And so a lot of these programs are in our cities, are in our states, right? And are functioning not only locally, but also to exert U.S. Hegemony more broadly, right? And to violate human rights. And I'll just add that some of the folks that were trained at School of the Americas are those that assassinated the former president of Haiti, Jovenel Moise, which sort of kicked off the now almost 4 years of the current imperialist crisis in Haiti. They learned their tactics in Georgia. And so there's also a couple internal objectives for the campaign. Obviously we want to coordinate the structure, develop the capacity for both sustained action and mass consciousness building, right? So being with our people and understanding how are we actually taking action. And then linking the political objectives and the implementation of the campaign, again, across scales, right? So thinking about how are we doing this with our members individually, how are they engaging, how are we doing it as an organization as a whole, and then how are we bringing in other folks or encouraging other folks to take part in these actions or connect to the actions. And so I'm just gonna leave here like a list of some of these strategies and tactics that we talked about that we've engaged in, that we are engaging in around, like I mentioned, we can talk more about the strategies and tactics, but this is the what is here for public consumption. And some of that includes political education and mass consciousness building, right? Power building at a local level, understanding, how are we building coalitions or campaigns locally or united fronts, or engaging in work with those in, the labor, in organized labor. How are we thinking about the complementary actions from a resistance standpoint that we can be taking up? Boycott and divestment, pressure campaigns, and strategic coalitions.